All right, well, Tyson, thanks so much for hanging out with us. For people who don't know who who are you and what do you do?
My name is Tyson Rosage. I'm the designer, or a designer at Treehouse. Mostly what I primarily work on is designing the user interface and kind of develop the product flow for how people navigate all our content.
That's awesome. So let's back up and start at the very beginning. Where'd you first grow up?
I grew up in Olympia, Washington. I've always been directed towards, art stuff. I mean, I guess that's kind of, I think most people who got into doing design came from that type of background. I was very much into music, playing guitar and playing in bands, and that's actually kind of what was my gateway into actually getting into doing stuff for the web, which was, we needed a website at the time, and that was something I kind of took upon myself to kind of figure out how to do, and kind of develop that over the years into now being, I guess, my career.
So when was that you first got into it?
I actually got into like computers and stuff like that very late relative to I think a lot of other people. I mean, I don't think I really got into it seriously until my senior year of high school, and then I got very obsessive about it in my first few years of college. But actually so much that I didn't actually finish college because I had actually spent a lot of time in college doing freelance work for other bands. And throughout that whole process, I actually had kind of developed somewhat of a following amongst other people in the design community, and so I kind of worked to get myself some kind of attention at some other companies. And actually the main thing that got me my first job was I used a website called purevolume.com, and at the time it was like a MySpace music kind of website, a network for bands to kind of promote their music and all that. And so I would actually find bands on this website that I thought were had potential to grow as a band, but maybe they were lacking in terms of their web presence or whatever. So I'd actually reach out to them and say, hey, I'll actually do a website for you for free. And the reason why I was kind of willing to give it up for free was because at the time I was in college and I didn't really need the money. I needed things in my portfolio, and that was way more important to me. And so I actually wrote something about this on my blog at the time. This is when blogging was a big deal. It was like 04, 05. Actually, some referrers from that blog, because I had cited how I used Pure Volume to meet bands, they were the people who made purevolume.com. They found out about that, and they actually reached out to me because they had seen a bunch of my other design work, and they actually offered me a job. And they were in Boston, so it was actually a pretty huge departure. I actually drove all the way over to Boston, and I worked for them for about 4 years before moving back to the West Coast, being in California.
Wow. So where did you go to school?
I went to school at Western Washington University, and at that time, I only was there for about a year and a half before I ended up moving off to take on this job. But I was there to study like graphic design, stuff like that. I mean, they had a course for like web stuff, but it was pretty primitive. It was much more like focused about like, well, this is your way of getting your posters online. You're just going to be kind of exporting your Photoshop documents, and then it puts it in a Dreamweaver, and there you go.
Right.
Which is not really the practical way of doing these things at scale.
So what did you do over at Pure Volume?
So at Pure Volume, for the first few years, my primary responsibilities were we did a lot of partnerships with record labels that did very like custom campaigns on Pure Volume. So they were kind of more like doing one-off pages where, for me, it was actually really fun because I kind of got into design through like, wanting to make cool graphics and stuff like that. It was much more visually focused. So getting to like work with all these different bands, a lot of bands that I was already fans of long before I even got this job, it was kind of like an honor to be able to work with like all the cool stuff that bands that I really respected, were using to promote their stuff. And so I would use a lot of these assets and make these pages to help them promote their new album or new singles or whatever it might have been. But then over the course of time with that job, it actually kind of developed further into being more responsible for the actual like user interface, the website, and any kind of new features, designing all those kinds of things. So it kind of evolved into being much more of like product design versus like doing more like advertising kind of design, if that makes
No,
any
no,
sense
no.
in terms of the difference.
I was actually going to ask, like, yeah, how you made that transition. 'Cause it sounds like you started out as a graphic designer, but was it because they were assigning you those things, or was it because, you know, you really had more of an interest in making product decisions?
Well, at that time when I first got into it, I mean, I was like 20 years old. I didn't really have much perspective on like what I really wanted to do. All I knew is what I really, I knew what I found to be really fun, which was, you know, the graphics side of it. Like that was my number, that's how I got into it, and that was like where my attention was. And I think that like, you know, when you work with other people that, you know, they're focused on other aspects of like how do you actually use visual design but have it be more complementary to a greater purpose, which is, you know, trying to fulfill or trying to get like users through a particular like set of objectives or whatever. I mean, that's kind of a weird abstraction way to say it, but you know, it gave me this perspective on like how do you actually apply these things in different ways than just like artistic, you know, which I think a lot of people think of design as being as like, oh, it's just like, you know, fun artistic ways of delivering a message. When I think it's actually it can be a lot more complex than that. And I think once I understood those complexities, it really changed my my interests over time.
So how big was the Pure Volume team?
I think it was like about 10 or 11 of us, and it grew to be about 25 or so. I mean, but it kind of went up and down as our goals as a company changed. We did a lot of different things.
So then after that, you went to Digg.
Yeah.
Right?
So yeah, I was in the Pure Volume, and actually eventually moved to Los Angeles, and I was there for about a year doing that. And then after that, you know, I'd been at the company for about 4 years, and you know, been really heavily like intertwined with the entertainment industry, you know, music focused. And I think I was just ready for something new, and so I moved up to San Francisco, and I got a job at Digg.
So did you move up to San Francisco without having a job? You just
Actually,
moved here just to like try to get a job, or?
Actually, I did move up to San Francisco, you know, saying that I would be working remote, and you know, I definitely took that seriously. But ultimately, I did know that I was moving up here where they had a lot more opportunities. I mean, that was kind of the greater purpose, I think. I mean, I didn't really like LA, so it didn't really fit with me culture-wise. I think San Francisco was better for that, and it obviously affords a lot more opportunities in the tech industry and for someone with my skill set. So,
Sure. So how did you first connect with your job at Digg?
so one of the guys I worked with at Pure Volume was a guy named Ryan Sims. He's a fantastic designer. He's actually a designer at RDO. He is now. At the time we had worked there, he knew Daniel Burka, who was the creative director at Digg. And I knew that he knew him because they had been on a panel together at South by Southwest. And so I reached out to him because we had worked together for a few years, and I was like, hey, you know, I'm kind of interested in this job. Do you think you could put a word in for me? And he did, and I actually got a call back from Daniel like the next day. So it was very quick and very speedy. It was very nice.
No. When was that? Was that when Digg was like really new, or was it kind of a big popular thing at the time?
2008.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it was like right before the 2009.
So it's actually almost at its height.
Sort of, yeah. Digg's height was probably more around 2007. The company had grown. I think once the company actually like grew at Digg over about 40, it was about when things like kind of the focus got a little bit different at that at Digg, you know, as a company. When I started working there, it was about 80 people, and there had been a lot of cultural shifts. And at the time, well, what's funny is that the entire time that I've been like interviewing with people at Digg, like Daniel was kind of like one of the main reasons why I actually wanted to work there. And when I just moved to San Francisco, because we had actually interviewed when I was still in LA. When we had started interviewing when I was in LA. So when I moved to San Francisco, I wanted to reconnect with him. It was like, hey, you know, I'm in town. I'm ready to like start working if you guys are still looking to hire for this position. And he said to me, he's like, oh, you should come out. We should go get beers. And so we went and got beers. And he told me that night that he was that he was leaving Digg. And I was like, oh no, that kind of changes like my my motivations. I mean, ultimately, I still thought Digg was an interesting product that I wanted to have the opportunity to work on. but it did kind of make it a little bit different. And you know, in looking back, it was definitely indicative of like a very big cultural change at Digg as a company. You know, just what the relationships were amongst all the people who work there, especially the people who had been working there for, you know, years prior.
Right. So what were some of the specific things that you got the opportunity to work on?
There was one main creative director who had filled Daniel Burke's position, and that was Jeffrey Kalmakoff, who actually had come from Threadless, which is a really, you know, interesting kind of T-shirt selling site, and it's more than just kind of e-commerce. It had definitely more of a social networking or social aspect to it. So he was somebody I was really excited to work with. Basically, I had never really worked with a design team so much. So that was actually the biggest thing that was a new experience for me. I wouldn't be surprised that if just about any designer who's been first put in that position, you know, struggles a little bit, because if you're used to working on your own, you can make all your own decisions. You know, having to make compromises and all these kinds of things can be a little bit of an adjustment. Not to say that I didn't ever have to make any compromises or whatever like that at Pure Volume. It was definitely a little bit different because it was much more like mechanized, because you're this big company with tons of people involved in it, especially like the product itself. So it definitely was like a little bit of an eye-opening, like getting used to like designing a process, like even outside of just your design process. You know, it's more like a collaborative process.
Right. So how did that collaboration work? Were you just kind of given assignments top down, or did you work with like one or two other designers, or?
So Jeffrey, who was the manager there, like he was very good, I think, at like trying to you know, put together a plan. A little bit frustrating at times because a lot of us had a lot of different, like pretty conflicting ideas as to what vision we had for it. And at this time, there wasn't really that product visionary. Like a lot of people think like Kevin Rose was the product visionary. He definitely was at very specific times in Digg's history, but at the time that I came there, he was very little involved. Mm-hmm. And so there wasn't really that like one go-to person that everybody at the company could like rally behind and say that we trust his decision. So at that time, like the design team was kind of making that decision, but because we disagreed so much, there was a lot of ambiguity as to like what the direction was really going to be, and so a lot of that kind of got pushed on Jeffrey, who was the creative director. So I think a lot of people kind of looked to him in a negative way because they felt like he was the one making the ultimate calls.
How do you work through those situations where it kind of takes a long time to reach consensus on something, where, you know, there's a decision that needs to be made and you just kind of feel like you're talking about it forever? Like, what do you push towards?
So I think probably the best way to pare down disagreements is to try to take whatever decision you're trying to make and break it down to the most fundamental level where you're actually talking about real objective goals. Because if you have that one objective goal, then any opinion somebody might have, you have to put up against that, and you have to say that, well, does that fit this objective goal? Because if you say like, oh, well, I think the button should be green instead of purple or something like that, well, you have to then ask the question, does that affect the objective goal? I mean, sometimes you won't have an answer, and so you'll just kind of have to make a decision in that case. But in a lot of instances, people will have strong opinions about how something should be laid out or whatever like that. And sometimes those can lose sight of that objective goal, which might be, we want to get somebody to submit a story to Digg. And a lot of people are like, well, wouldn't it be cool if like the thing flew up and spun around at a 360 and you know unicorns came flying through? Yeah, it'd be cool, but could that get in the way of the objective goal, which is to get people to submit stories to Digg? You know, I think that's ultimately, I think, the best process to at least try to pare down some of the disagreements people might have.
Do you think that's kind of your method for making design decisions, that's just reducing the friction as much as possible and getting people to those goals? Or how do you kind of model that in your mind?
It's hard. I mean, I think it's hard to say it in one general way. I think that if you could pose a problem to me and then I could say that, and I could probably dissect that more into saying, okay, this is what we want to do. Why? Most importantly, why do we want to do that? What greater objective does that actually connect to? I mean, you can extrapolate these things until you get into infinity, you know.
Sure.
But you know, you got to stay close to it if what you're really, you know, arguing about is this one particular feature or whatever it might be. So it's like, yeah, like I said, it's hard to really give one general answer. But
do you think about the features kind of individually, or do you try to contextualize them and always keep the big picture in mind?
I think always big picture in mind, but sometimes that can also have negative byproducts. I mean, sometimes if you only think big picture, it actually can dilute your ability to come up with interesting ways to solve the little details, because ultimately the little details do make up the big picture. So, you know, you don't want to like think big picture so much to the point in which you kind of just create mediocrity, you know, mediocrity. I think I said that right. I don't know.
Mediocrity.
Yeah.
So you're at Digg for a while, and then eventually you went to Treehouse, which is where you're at now.
Yeah. So that was awesome. I mean, I definitely say one of the most valuable things I took away from my experience at Digg was that I met some incredible people that you know, are very well connected with so many great opportunities in this whole area, or even not even just San Francisco, because obviously Treehouse is not a San Francisco-based company, but Kevin, you know, from Digg, who I, you know, work with quite a bit, he was an advisor at Treehouse, and he knew Ryan Carson pretty well, and so it was actually very, very lucky, because I was in the middle of like trying to find the next thing, and so I wrote Kevin an email saying, "Hey, do you have any ideas like what companies I might want to be like looking at? They're doing interesting things." And and Kevin he called me on the phone like 20 minutes later, which is completely unheard of for someone like Kevin, because he, you know, he has, like, I'm sure he's flooded with email and, you know, prioritizing all these things is whatever. So I got this phone call from him, and I'm like, and I'm kind of shocked they called me, and then he's like, "Yeah, you know, Ryan's in town. You should have lunch with him tomorrow." And then like an hour later, he emails me, and he's like, "Oh, I didn't even get this email. I just called you because Ryan was looking for a designer, and so he hit me up." So yeah, that kind of worked out really well. And Ryan and I had lunch the next day. He was in town because I guess he was finalizing something with some funding or whatever.
Yeah.
And then I think it was just a matter of weeks later, we did some kind of projects for the interview process, and then eventually I was in the door.
Wow, that's really serendipitous. I didn't know the full details of that story.
Yeah, it worked out pretty well that way.
Huh. Oh, that's cool. So you went on to Treehouse, and at Treehouse we have all of these gamification features, right? Do you feel like that was that your experience at Digg was valuable in putting together some of those features with like badges and things like that?
Yeah, I guess you could. I guess so. I think that a lot of times, like if I'm going from one product to the next, I don't really like to think too comparatively about like, oh, well, this product does badges and this product does badges, so I can somehow match those.
Right.
I think there's kind of bigger concepts that you can extrapolate from very, very different products. Let's say one that doesn't have badges at all or doesn't have any kind of gamification things, that you can find some kind of overlap. And so I don't necessarily look to like where there is the most like obvious overlap to find ideas or methodologies that work for something like for Treehouse. I think that, you know, the gamification stuff on Digg had its own mechanisms that were very unique to its application,
right?
And Treehouse has quite different ones. I think the motivations are very different between the two products, and I think that's probably where the big fundamental difference is. I mean, here's one of the big differences. I mean, if you think about Treehouse, there could be one user on Treehouse, and that one user would get the same amount of value to them as an individual as if there were a million people using Treehouse. Whereas a lot of other products like Digg or a lot of these social networking sites, like they only operate under the constraints of like the network effect. You know, like
critical mass.
Critical mass. And so I think that like that really is kind of that's what makes these things very different. So when you say like, oh well, Digg had a Digg button, and that's kind of like gamification thing. People wanted to game the system to get their stories, you know, promoted and whatever. I mean, that those constraints of the fact that it's like a network effect versus like, and that's like your motivation is you kind of want to game that system to do that versus like you want to game yourself in a way. Like you're trying to learn things like that. Your motivations are very different. So I think that how you approach those problems is very different too.
So when you're designing user interfaces, I often think about problems in terms of design patterns. That kind of helps me chunk things out. Do you think about them in terms of design patterns, or do you think about what the user is trying to accomplish? Because like when I think about stuff, I think, okay, the user wants to pick 2 things or 1 thing off of a list of like 1,000 things. Okay, I could maybe use like autocomplete to do that. Is that kind of how you model things, or do you look to design patterns a lot?
I think it's a little bit of both because, like, for example, for your example, you know, autocomplete like is a way to pare down, you know, thousands of entries or something like that, or choices. But you also have to ask your question. You also have to ask the question: is does the user explicitly know what they're looking for? Because autocomplete really only works if they're like explicitly thinking, like typing. You know, it's like it's kind of like that search versus browse idea. You know, if you don't know what you want, you might want to scan down the list a little bit to see like what kind of choices you have. And then maybe that sparks an idea of what you want to type. But ultimately, like you might want to get a little bit of a hint. So like that's kind of where you might have to think about like what is the user thinking and what do they want to do versus like, well, patterns will ultimately take care of it. You know, they don't necessarily work that way in every case.
So what are some of the biggest challenges that you've come across when designing Treehouse?
I think that one of the big things is that there are a lot of different ways to learn that work for different people in different ways. Like I kind of think about even just how we made this change or this change in direction towards project-based content versus just like you know, learning disciplines. It's kind of like the way I've described it to other people is it's kind of like the difference between learning like if like the old way would be like if you just dropped a Spanish dictionary on someone's lap and said, here, learn Spanish. You know, just learn all the words and you'll just put them together in a way that makes sense.
Encyclopedic, right?
Right. Where versus someone saying, well, let's go somewhere where everybody's speaking Spanish and maybe you'll actually be able to pick it up because you're learning it in context and in practice. And I think that, you know, one of the big challenges I think was coming to these realizations along the way is that like, well, you know, we thought this way for so long because it just seemed like the obvious way. Like, if you want to learn CSS, we'll just teach you the syntax and you'll have it nailed. But that's not really the way that you learn these things. And so I think like those big challenges I think were kind of making sense of where there was this ultimate friction happening.
Well, to wrap things up, I want to ask you, what advice would you give to designers that are maybe just starting out? Or maybe a better question is, what advice do you wish you could have given yourself?
Well, before you said the thing about giving yourself, well, the one thing I would say is, which was the thing that I did do when I was in college, is if you're in a position where you can afford to do things for free, especially at the time that you're getting started out. When you're getting started out, the most important thing you can have to actually like further yourself is to just keep working. I mean, I know it's like, it's kind of a chicken and the egg kind of situation. It's like, well, how do I get work if I don't have experience? Well, you need to kind of make some compromise there in that case. Or you don't have to, but you know, in my case, like I chose to make the sacrifice of, you know, making money because it was more important to me at that time of getting started to have work to then fuel the next project.
You have to make your own experience, right?
Right, exactly. So if you're in a position where you can do things pro bono or contribute in some way that you know, can get you work without necessarily having to have previous works, I would recommend doing that. Because ultimately the best way that you're ever going to, you know, improve in your craft is to keep doing it. You know, you can't just like listen to what everybody else is saying around you. You actually have to put it into practice and learn by doing. And you know, ultimately, I think that's why I think doing the project focus learning is ultimately going to be the most effective way to you know, imprint these principles in your mind.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for taking the time, man.
All right.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.